The first story. The Rotting City. I hope that those who have started reading this haven't had to go on the run. Unfortunately, I had to. For some reason, I decided to start with this story. Although, what's the difference between a run and a story? Conditional runs can be good because they have to save something in the end, but not in my situation. The whole point of this story is that some of my races lead to others, which is rather stupid. Now, I'll try to explain it in more detail. My name is Oleg and I'm 30 years old. I'm sorry to say that I am a fraudster. 2 months ago, I had to flee the country after that fact was revealed. If you think of my escapes as more than one dynamic escape, involving filling bags with a variety of spare passports, I have to disappoint you. In reality, the police officer who was protecting me called and told me that I needed to leave the city for a few months, which I did. Now, it is possible to describe the fraud I committed. You know those websites like OLX? Maybe some of you have even contacted my employees, and when you posted another expensive, unnecessary item for sale, you thought you had fooled fate. Please don't blame me for it. I truly believe that there is an eternal alchemical formula in life that has worked since Babylon. Some people are looking to deceive others, while others want to be deceived themselves. Therefore, nobody carefully checked the links I provided for the details. That's why my business has been so profitable. However, the irony is that when I had to leave, I was only able to afford a few pieces of green foliage. Apart from a dozen apples and a relatively expensive laptop, there was nothing else. I left Kharkov without much difficulty. I calmly took a taxi to the nearest bus stop, where I purchased a one-way ticket to the town of Berezin in the same region. The town has a population of 120,000 and is located 10 miles away from Starovorovka. As I boarded the bus, I sighed and watched as all that was familiar and beloved disappeared from view. The journey to Berezny took an hour and a half, during which time I was filled with regret and fear. I thought about how to survive and what I would do if my business was shut down. I had been turning over these heavy thoughts in my mind, and I had come to the conclusion that the best thing to do was to get really drunk. Finally arriving at the destination, getting off the bus, I smelled the heavy odor of sewage. This smell was so strong that it interrupted my lit cigarette and felt like it went through the filter, igniting the tobacco with its scent. The last time I had encountered such an odor was in my early childhood, when we lived on the ground floor of a communal apartment. One morning, we woke to find the entire floor flooded with sewage, as pipes had burst in the basement and the first floor had turned into a shit Venice. My mom told me to stay on the windowsill and not go anywhere. I remember looking at a bedside table that was floating around the room. On its side were stickers of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I looked at them and saw the turtles disappearing smoothly under the brown liquid. And now, after all those years, my life is doing the same thing. I caught a taxi at the train station and took it to a hotel. I wanted to delay the search for an apartment until later and get drunk until unconsciousness. The hotel, with the unassuming name Edge, was a small Soviet-era building with a European twist. It had the appearance of being civil and friendly, but when you went to the bathroom, you found yourself in a dirty environment. Where, perhaps, it would have been good to reflect on the white diamond-shaped tiles that covered the walls, creating a sense of blackness. I carefully hid my switched-off phone, took the money, and went out to find a bar. The same smell haunted me in the hotel. I even asked the receptionist about it, and they looked at me with disbelief. When I went outside, the smell continued to bother me. It started with the smell of sewage and then moved into the spectrum of sweet, rotten, dead, and stinky smells. I thought there must be an abattoir or something similar somewhere, and that the wind had changed in the city and now everything smells bad. While I was walking down the street, no one outwardly reacted to the smell. There were a lot of people out on the streets, but the city was small enough that provinciality and smallness were not felt visually. When I passed the main square, I was surprised in my own way. Unofficial people gathered near an empty pedestal where Lenin once stood, and nearby, a couple of skateboarders were jumping off granite slabs near flower beds, failing repeatedly. Real life was going on everywhere, just like it was in Kharkov. With those thoughts, I found myself in a rather attractive-looking bar. There, I finally started drinking. Maybe it was because my stomach was empty, or maybe it was because of stress. But I got drunk in just a few hours. Here, you probably have something to brag about. No matter how much I drink, there's never such a thing as the lights going out. It's only after I go to bed that I can pass out. Until then, I might even fall or crawl, but I'll always be conscious until I get home. Therefore, what I'm about to tell you doesn't seem like a dream to me today. After leaving the bar, I stumbled towards the hotel, which was dark outside. I could roughly remember my way, but I imagined that the empty monument to Lenin would be on the left, so I had to walk straight from the bar. However, instead of coming to the hotel, I ended up in a small wasteland with no one around to ask for directions. I tried to turn around and go back to the bar, but the square with the pedestal was missing. Although I thought I had walked back without making any turns, I found myself on the same streets with small dark houses instead of the lighted square. Not knowing where I was or what to do, I kept walking. I felt lost and confused, unsure of where I was heading or where I wanted to go. If I saw flashes of light, I would go towards them, and from there, to other places. I wandered around in the dark. It seemed like an entire night. I walked, and then I began to hear a deep, dull ringing sound. It was as if a huge bell was ringing somewhere underground. Boom! When I heard this noise, I started walking towards it, focusing roughly on the vibration. Boom! The noise was getting closer, and I felt a good vibration in my stomach. The vibration from this sound was so strong, it went through my whole body. The back of my neck was tingling and felt like it was going to tickle. With this vibration and ringing, I completely lost track of the elusive thread of drunk consciousness. Therefore, when two silhouettes grabbed me by the arms, I didn't really resist. For a second, I thought they were tied, but after they didn't visually grow into anything more, I relaxed a little. Instead of the same darkness I had previously wandered through, we moved confidently towards light. They guided me by the arm, towards the already more distinguishable ringing of a bell. I won't dissemble, at that moment, I felt drunk and brave. I couldn't even imagine that something bad was happening, but they continued to guide me by the hand. That I can't remember exactly how long we were walking, but a large patch of light on our path brought me out of my alcoholic stupor. As I tried to focus, I squinted and could not see the source of the light. However, what happened next actually sobered me up. We walked into the light, and there was a building behind it with an endless flight of stairs leading down. One glimpse into it was enough to actually sober me up. Giant brown steps leading down endlessly, everything was leaking, like it was rotting. The smells of sewage and rotten meat that had haunted me throughout the day assaulted my nostrils tenfold, and I vomited. The steps beneath my feet were soft and squishy, accompanied by a disturbing slurping noise. The sound of the bell, which was so strong and resonant before, had disappeared somewhere. Everything around us seemed to be alive in the womb, moving very slowly, pumping strange substances through its glossy walls. There were also noises similar to those of digestion coming from the walls. They seemed to have their own lives. That we kept walking down the tunnel, and I was trying to find out the source of the strange light under the ceiling. They seemed like torches, but the fire in them seemed to be rotting. As we went deeper, my feet got caught in the steps and I had to hold on to the unknown companions around me. Speaking of those companions, I really wanted to look up at them, but as soon as I looked, I started feeling sick. My head spun and my stomach ached again. They all looked runny and unnatural, like plastic men with melted faces and limbs. What happened next, as I have been branded it for a long time, was that we stepped down endlessly, and I periodically felt exhausted and dreamed of waking up. But everything was just starting. Finally, after reaching the bottom of an endless staircase, we came out into a huge room with brown columns and empty chandeliers. The columns and chandeliers also seemed to be draining, as the chandeliers occasionally dripped something on to the watery floor surface. They were covered in ulcers and boil-like things that pulsated subtly. This gigantic hall seemed to be some kind of temple, with an odd altar visible at its center. Nearby the columns were long, decaying benches, and there were strange lamp-like objects on the side. The hall was filled with lively, dirty, and dripping people who gathered around the chandeliers. My companions left me, making a gurgling sound, and I went into the middle of this temple. Irregular, covered in inflammations, gangrenous spots, and pearl streaks, people kept putting candles in small holes, pushing them against the candelabra. They stuck together, producing vile noises at the same time. The candles they set had not burned, but had begun to decompose from the top down, and they were making a sound, squeezing it out of their throats as they squeezed out. Beggars sat under the columns, in unnatural positions, begging for alms. Those who put their hand in their mouth, stretching out a palm ooze with blood through their womb, were thick puddles, with hardly any discernible features of human flesh or limbs, with only a small island showing an outstretched palm. As my disgust and the thought, could this not be a dream, began to turn me away from the exit, the doors made a sucking noise of collapsing. Near the altar in the center, the first noises were heard from an unpleasant organ similar to an intestinal plexus. Only rotting could sound like that, like the sound of rotting was coming out of those disgusting pipes. All the people in the room began to sit down simultaneously, and I felt everyone's attention focused on me for a moment. Quickly, I sat down on an empty seat on a long brown bench. My body sank deeply into the seat, and the sticky surface of the backrest soaked through my clothes and felt against my skin. There was a heavy silence in the room, everyone staring intently forward. A silhouette separated itself from the wall's surface and began to flow slowly towards the altar. No, it wasn't coming from behind a secret door, it emerged from the wall itself. Seeing this, I completely lost my ability to comprehend anything. The entire congregation, defying the concept of God, began to make strange motions with their hands as if they were massaging unnatural substances over their bodies. He began to sound strangely, slurping, draining, and gurgling, making an unsettling guttural noise that he was also accompanied by an oddly frightening choir that emerged from the walls. Instead of singing, a sound like the buzzing of flies and the trickling of pus poured from their mouths, as if decay was singing a song. I understood that this phenomenon had a beneficial effect on the people sitting around me. The tiny old lady sitting next to me, consumed by necrosis to the size of a toy, was weeping with happiness. Amber sticky liquid was coming out of her eyes, which she eagerly smeared over her body, repeating this gesture throughout her entire arrival. When nothing could have been worse, suddenly everything went quiet. It took me a moment to realize that everyone was looking at me. The preacher, dripping with vile substance, let out a harsh squawk. I was grabbed by the arms and dragged towards the altar. The last thing I remember was being forced to consume a small object that resembled a pine cone, but which was actually something inside the scales. Its surface moved and slightly contracted. Although I felt a level of human disgust and struggled internally as they gave me the bump, I accepted it myself, following which there was nothingness that I woke up in my room surrounded by scattered wet clothes. As soon as I opened my eyes, I vowed never to drink again. It was pouring outside, making the room dark and gloomy. Flashes of the night before flashed through my mind, and more were added to it as I made my way home through puddles, tripping and falling. I almost passed out somewhere under the cover of a front door, but I was chased away by the cleaning staff who were already working very early. That awful dream did not leave my mind. The reason was professional reformation. Due to my line of work, I have a phenomenal memory of details. Even when drunk, I would remember the number of the taxi that picked me up and the exact amount I spent at the bar down to the penny. So, the events from that night, I still remember today, although for a long time, I thought they were just a dream. After waking up, I felt terribly tired and tormented by the terrible hangover. However, the vile smell of the city seemed to have disappeared somewhere. I spent the whole day in the bathroom, trying to wash away that awful night and the leftover hangover. On the very next day, I started to slowly come back to my senses and started looking for a place to stay and thinking about what to do next. Instead of describing my tedious trips to apartment complexes, meetings with real estate brokers, and boring daily searches, let's just say that a couple of weeks later, I finally found something that suited me. It was a small, cozy one-bedroom apartment with a lovely courtyard and not far from the city center, overlooking an empty Lenin statue. For the first time in 2 weeks, I emailed the landlord, the one I was paying rent to, and got encouraging news from the police. The office business started to slow down, and everything seemed to fade into the background, except the fact that I needed to close some things and give money to others. The police officer advised me to start thinking about a new plan. My life had been getting better. I cooked healthy meals for myself, played new video games, and watched TV shows. However, everything seemed somewhat ordinary. After completing the paperwork, I went into the kitchen and started making meatballs for a soup from frozen minced meat. If you like to drink, you might understand me. It's the hardest thing to do, to try not to drink alcohol, not to be in grief or despair, and to restrain oneself on a joyous wave. Maybe 2 weeks ago, I had sworn inside myself not to drink. But after hearing such news, I threw away all the prepared meatballs and, without putting them in the fridge, dressed and ran outside. It was 6 p.m., and I ran like a possessed man towards the bar. Although the town is small, there are no problems with a wide variety of restaurants and bars. When I went to the first restaurant, I ordered a vodka and a hot pan with mushrooms. After my solitary drink, my collective drink grew quickly. I was joined by obese aunts and their very drunk and unnaturally red husbands. They were members of the executive committee who were celebrating the next position they had achieved. They praised, questioned, and threatened. Once again, everything seemed to fly by quickly. At 11 o'clock, the place was closing and my new friends invited me to a karaoke bar that was almost outside of the city. We called a taxi and drove off, taking a long route that led us to a large area surrounded by houses. From there, we could hear drunken singing and shouting. Everything seemed to be going well at first, and the first few hours did not seem to portend any trouble. However, after a while, the husband of one of my friends fell asleep and, when he woke up a few hours later, attacked me, shouting that I had stolen his wallet. He kept shouting and threatening to call the police, so I knew that meeting with the authorities would be very unpleasant for me. I'm not a fighter by nature, but I was able to subdue the drunk man without much difficulty. After throwing him unconscious between two houses, I escaped from the institution where we had just spent the night through bushes and a small decorative lake. There was only one road we could take, and if the police were driving, they would only have gone along that road, so I decided to take a different route, going back through the fields, with the houses visible in the distance as a guide. It seemed like an ordinary drunk night, and I had not drunk much, and had even somewhat sobered up after what happened. But I could not explain to myself what had happened next. As I got closer to the city limits, and the houses mentioned above, I started to notice strange movements around the roofs. It was as if long garbage bags were flying around the roof. I had seen something similar once at a construction site, when packages of building materials were flying, crashing into the unfinished walls. My thoughts were similar. A person's purpose is to give themselves a clear understanding as quickly as possible, and to recognize and defend what they see, but as I got closer, the more strange what I saw became. What I initially thought was a long object was actually a limb that extended deep into the house. A serpentine appendage, slightly wider than a window, pierced through the building, passing through it. The appendage was visible in many parts of the house and was moving further away, gradually shrinking. This movement was very unusual and unnatural. I do not know what it could be. A creature? Nah, something. It was moving and seemed quite real, but the house did not appear to notice its presence in any way. There were no signs of damage or holes at the places where the serpentine creature emerged. The surface of the building remained smooth and intact. For some reason, I was sure that, as soon as I got closer, the object I had seen earlier would disappear magically. As soon as I approached, however, it turned out that it did not disappear. Rather, it felt my presence and started to shrink even further. Like a parasite, she began moving faster, crawling into another house and entwining it on all sides. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This couldn't possibly be happening. Everything seemed to be finally taking shape in my mind, and I couldn't think of a better way to convince myself that what I was experiencing was good for me. That I didn't continue running, but walked calmly instead, forbidding myself from thinking about anything. As the street began to light up, I looked around with apprehension at the silent houses surrounding me and walked towards home. Over the past few weeks, I had already begun to navigate the area. There were 3 main streets in the city, and any of them could provide an accurate guide, so I walked home down one of those main streets. I walked and thought nothing, found my house, entered the apartment, removed my things, and went to sleep without foreplay. In my dream, I imagined a perverted art house that combined what I had seen at night, adding apocalyptic Christian overtones to it. In the morning, I woke up again with a hangover, remembering yesterday's horrible sight like a fleeting dream that had passed quickly. After taking a shower, I walked to the kitchen and saw a bowl containing yesterday's leftover minced meat, which I discarded on the table as I rushed to drink. Looking at the bowl, I couldn't understand what was wrong. Then it dawned on me that the minced meat had increased in size. It had increased in volume. I hesitantly put my hand in the bowl and scooped up some minced meat, but my fingers went through it for some reason, unusual for its soft consistency. There were some dense irregularities. When I turned on the light and looked more closely, I was horrified and threw the minced meat out. The meat was covered in tiny appendages, similar to the roots of flax or sunflowers. In the depths of the bowl, those appendages were even more terrifyingly long. This is how flaxes and sunflowers germinate when they are soaked in water, but for meat to sprout. I felt so creeped out and disgusted that I opened the window and dumped the contents on the grass outside. My apartment is on the ground floor, so the disgusting sprouting meat was hidden in a small grassy area near the windows. With fear and disgust, I looked at the grass. I tried to explain to myself what had happened. Meat cannot germinate, I repeated to myself. Wishing to cleanse myself of the thought, I washed my hands with toilet domestos, watered them. As I did so, it seemed to me that things started to go downhill. My days have been strange, to put it mildly. My attic has not moved, but I have begun to live as if it were all mine. I don't trust the food, I eat only vegetables, although I'm not a vegetarian or even a vegan. It has only been a month since my run and I have already become lazy and gained a lot of weight. Because I was eating all kinds of breads and pastas, my weight has rapidly exceeded 100. Before that, I could always keep my weight within 85 pounds. From then on, people with fat will understand me. I couldn't even squat on my shoes, my belly felt like something foreign. I began to put my shoes on standing up, bending my leg at the knee toward me. The number 4 is peculiar. Why am I telling you all this? This is where my real escape started. It only took a month to run, as usual, and I was going to the store. Standing at the door, I began to put on my shoes. Leaning against the wall with one hand, I raised my leg to my chest and began to insert the heel of my shoe. I helped myself with my fingers and then my hand, which was resting on the wall, somehow gently sunk into it. Thoughts of rotten pears flashed through my mind, as we would run around garages as kids, then jump to the ground and get my hand stuck on one. How softly it crumbled under my hand. The wall also let my hand sink in gently. I quickly removed it and looked at the sticky fingers covered in gray slime. It made me feel disgusting. After pulling back the peeling wallpaper, I noticed a fairly large stain on the wall. It was strange and unnatural, like a rotten hole in a stone. But stones can't rot or decompose like proteins. No, it can't. After pouring the slimy substance into a garbage bag and washing my hands, I went outside to throw it away. There was a bit of a nasty fog in my head after what I had seen that I and the store. I continued to wander aimlessly, buying everything on my list without noticing, and returned home. When I reached the stairs, I paused at the door. For some reason, I didn't feel like living there anymore, but I had nowhere else to go. After standing there for a while, I opened the door and walked inside anyway. I walked in and was shocked. I expected to find a hole where there should have been one, but the wall was smooth and unblemished. After tapping the wall with my knuckle a couple of times, I stared at it in disbelief, still not believing what I was seeing. There was no sign of the hole, no evidence of anything that had happened. The wallpaper seemed to be in place, and there was no slime or other sign that anything had happened. It was like nothing had ever happened at all. Without thinking about it, I stormed out of the house and headed for the trash can. I had no doubts that what had happened in the past half an hour was real. My mind was definitely not making things up. When I reached the trash can, I opened the lid of the container where I had earlier thrown the bag with slime, and began to rummage through the garbage with my hands. The homeless people were giggling in an unusual way from the side of the street. One of them was wiping his mouth, while the other was licking his fingers. In the background, an empty trash bag was dancing in the wind and rising into the gray sky. No, guys. Thank you, but I have to leave, were my thoughts at the time. I walked back to my windows, where I had small, homemade flower beds in my garden. Right below my window, where I threw out sprouted minced meat a month ago, there had grown a strange plant. It was a combination of flowers and blisters, with small blisters spreading from the red trunk instead of leaves. The bud looked like a group of fused closed eyes and lips, and everything had unpleasant, gangrenous-looking shades. This flower caught my attention, and it opened its only eye as if to say something that I have never experienced so much pain and suffering as I did in that moment. It felt like his whole being was in pain. Absolute agony. Then, like humanity has done throughout its history, when faced with such an experience, I acted. I pushed the trunk of the plant with one foot and pinned it to the ground. Starting to trample on the part where the eyes were, I felt the top burst and the rotten teeth fall out of the lifeless lips, which broke open with the sound of insects. Enraged, I crushed this abomination under my feet. I did not notice at first how a piece of the house's plaster fell beside me, literally a few meters away. Another piece fell even closer. It felt as if the house had been trying to kill me, deliberately throwing pieces of plaster at my head. After running away, I quickly realized that I needed to get out of there as soon as possible. I ran into my apartment and started packing my things. During my escape, I managed to buy new clothes for under one bag. Jackets, jeans, and shoes were all purchased here. In such a hurry to pack, I didn't immediately remember about the money hidden in the envelope behind the closet. Over time, I had lost $1,000. The rest of the money was hidden in a small envelope behind the wardrobe. After pushing it away, my hand touched the wall. The wallpaper started to slowly peel off. It seemed like the degree of horror I had seen reached its logical limit, but the horror that awaited me was even more intense. A fallen piece of wallpaper revealed the wall, and numerous familiar images began to become clear. Human shapes, bird silhouettes, dog bodies, snakes. The walls were covered in creatures embedded in them. They were sealed in place. They seemed to be compressed and filled with something like brown resin. Like a madman, I started to tear off the wallpaper and the linoleum, the same thing. The house was a compressed mass of dead creatures. The worm-like one that I had forced myself to forget, which I had mistaken for a glitch, clearly surfaced in my mind. It had passed through the house like a parasite, seeping through every corner, leaving no traces. Maybe it was filling houses with anything it could catch, and the city was rotting without stopping. As if to confirm my thoughts, a piece of human torso fell from the wall. It should have been the last straw long ago, but it was her. Quickly packing up the rest of my belongings, I fled the house and started running like it was the last time I would ever do so. My 100+ kilograms seemed to have vanished somewhere. I desperately wanted to survive. It seems to me that when I ran under the asphalt, covered in pits, sad, dead faces looked up at me. These were the faces of people who were unfortunate enough to be caught in the middle of the movement. My run continued until the sign with the city's name was left behind. Only after I crossed that invisible line did I turn around. The city was still there, just as it had been when I first came here, but it was not enough. If horror has a climax, then that seems to have been what I experienced. Thick, serpentine tendrils began to emerge from all sides of the city and slowly began to move towards the center. They intertwined and pulsed, like some sort of dance, but I couldn't describe it that way. This monstrosity began to pull the houses towards it and rise, as if there was an unseen Hindu blowing on his huge pipe. The vile and moving mass flew freely into the sky and pulled the whole city along with it. As any normal person would in such a situation, I pulled out my phone and started filming this event. The entire city was rushing past the line of dense clouds, accompanied by a pulsating and black giant abomination woven together. While I was filming, the last chunk disappeared behind the clouds, revealing whole blocks of earth-like substance falling from them. My finger reached for the "stop" button, and I realized that I had been filming the darkness the whole time. There was a dark-colored growth on the back of my camera that reminded me of something unpleasant. The name of the city was rotting before my eyes in mere seconds. Turning around, I headed towards the highway in order to leave for a nearby major city. Usually, this kind of situation starts to take the wind out of your sails, but I wasn't in a hurry to say goodbye to my reasoning abilities. I had my own solution. Don't think about it. Life always throws something at you that tries to drive you mad. A black car, a police officer's car, everyone will try to put you in their place. If you continuously think about what could happen, you could quickly go insane. I was, and am still, a fraudster, and I believe my mind is flexible enough to deal with it. In any case, it's better than spending 12 years in prison for fraud. On the 25th business trip, the main thing was that, if necessary, I could deceive myself, and that greatly saved my mind. As you can see, it has helped me. Of all the things that have happened, there is only one thing that bothers me. The thought of a new organ appearing in my body. It's not a parasite or a tumor, but a fully fledged organ. I can't understand how it works or what role it plays in my body. I think about it, recalling my dream, which turned out not to be a dream. In it, there was a disgusting church. One detail still bothers me: after they fed me that thing, I stopped noticing the smell in the city. When I moved to Kiev a month later and settled into a new home, creating a new routine, I had the opportunity to take better care of my health. By avoiding expensive clinics, I eventually got my wish, and they found an abnormal growth in my body, about the size of a matchbox, in the area of my nose. Soon, they operated and removed a solid mass of pus from my body, but I know it's not pus. These were really strange and scary months of my life, but running has turned into a true escape. The most important thing is that I didn't become a psychopath who now tears off wallpaper in every new apartment. Although I confessed to that once in the first flat after fleeing that town. To be honest, I'm not interested in meeting with that hateful, pulsating giant. I try not even to think about it, but I still sometimes lose myself there in my imagination. I imagine it creeping past me in a decaying city, filling empty spaces with new, dead bodies that soon rot. Every inch of this town is made up of decaying material, corpses and decay. I feel sick and try to find comfort in the distant, cold stars in the night sky. When I look up at them, somewhere on the edge of my consciousness, the monologue continues, about where this NEH has gone, where those houses are carried away to. What hole is this whole city going to fill in? In what dimension? I'm trying to imagine stars that are unattainable by such creatures. I try my best to imagine an endless cosmos where their pulsating appendages won't reach. But no matter how hard I try, the thought continues to develop beyond the limits of consciousness. It's about how, when there's not enough for them, they'll start eating whole chunks of the planet and filling holes in their creepy world. Where there's nothing but pulsating motion and decay. How they'll devour the seas and turn them into pus for their world. How they'll consume the remnants of Earth's core. How they'll eat one planet after another and continue to consume the universe. Until the last suns in the endless cosmos have been consumed, they will consume everything until only one void remains that I'm sure they will find a way to fill the void as well. And when there is nothing left, there will be only them, pulsing vile black creatures in their dark and rotting dimension. The second story. Darkness. Katya asked with a sleepy voice, "Who's calling?" "Fuck knows," Sasha said, "it's the 5th time already in an hour and it keeps breaking off." He went to the window and looked outside. Instead of the usual image of a quiet nighttime courtyard, illuminated by the pair of lanterns, their light scattering over the surface of the sleeping cars, there were only small dots of light appearing somewhere in the distance, like stars reflected in turbulent waters, dancing with ripples, moving, and periodically disappearing. These lights were sending a message to the viewer, sending their Morse code. Outside the window, everything seemed to be constantly moving, transforming the familiar outlines of the neighboring houses into dark hills that were barely discernible. These giants seemed to be frozen, sheltering themselves from the strongest winds. The scene was both impressive and terrifying. The dust storm, which had been raging for the last 12 hours, seemed to have no intention of abating. A state of emergency had been declared in the area, and Sasha had been worried all day, rapidly tired of the long-awaited return home after a weekend away. The phone lit up once again, only to quickly go out again. Another missed call, and still no connection. Sasha wanted to go outside on the balcony and have a smoke, but Katya quickly persuaded him otherwise. "You'd better smoke in the kitchen near the sink, you can have one today. There's no need to breathe in this dust," she said, still lying in bed. After looking at the dim movement outside the window for a while, Sasha turned his attention to his blurry reflection on the windowpane. Something seemed strange to him, but he couldn't quite understand what it was. He wanted to look more closely, as if his mouth seemed to have grown larger, and he felt somewhat strange. The stare that he concentrated on was not willing to focus due to the continuous stream of darkness outside. The light from the kitchen was very dim behind him, and Sasha could not see his reflection clearly, but it was enough for him to notice the strange thing. He began staring intently again. The darkness at the mouth did not even try to disappear. Her words brought him out of a strange, almost hypnotic state. He pushed disturbing thoughts away and went to the kitchen, where he placed a stool next to the gas pump and lit a cigarette. He started thinking monotonously about the events of the day. An hour earlier, he had been sleeping peacefully. Then, these calls started. A strange unknown number. As soon as Sasha answered the calls, strange interference or even beeping began at the other end of the line. Everything was further complicated by the fact that Sasha might have received calls from work and couldn't simply turn off his phone. He had to continuously pick up the phone in the hope that the calls would stop. The phone lit up once again. This time, there were messages on Telegram. As soon as Sasha opened the Messenger app, the messages began pouring in one after another. In addition to the loss of cell phone communication, there had also been problems with the internet all day, and now, Sasha seemed to be stuck in a small area where mobile internet was working. "San, come urgently, I need your help, it's very urgent. Sonia, please, it's very important, please come as soon as possible, I beg you, Sonia, help me out." All these messages, in the last hour, had accumulated from his only friend in life, Tolia. They looked anxious, but even more frightening was the fact that he couldn't call him and find out what had happened. After stubbing out his cigarette, Sasha went to the bedroom and, trying not to wake Katya, began to dress quietly, but quickly. Katya woke up anyway. "Hey, where are you going?" she asked, surprised. "Something has happened at Tolia's. I'll go quickly, find out what it is, and then come back." "Go to bed, go to sleep," said Sasha calmly and put on jeans. "San, don't go, I'm begging you. You know what a storm it was. They said on TV not to go outside today," said Katya in a moaning voice. "Kate, please. I really need to go." After the accident, Tolia has already had some serious problems, and now there's something serious happening. I'll only be gone for a short time, you won't even know when I'm back. I'll call a taxi and be right back. Sasha, listen to me. I heard that some of the people who went into the storm today didn't come back. Please, don't go. You might not come back. Stay with me. Don't make such a foolish decision. Katya was screaming, sitting up in bed, but Sasha didn't listen to her. He put on his shoes and, seeing only her blurry outline in the dark bedroom, he thought he was talking to himself as he said, "I'll be back soon," and walked out the door. There, he found himself in a real hell on earth. Due to the dust, he could not see the usual landmarks and could not figure out which direction the bus station was, where taxi drivers usually stand. Unpleasant streams of stinging dust constantly hit his face and his eyes stung. He could already feel the dust on his teeth, it creaked and tasted bitter. The bus station was nearby, behind the next house, next to a supermarket. If I walked to it, then everything would be clear. With these thoughts, Sasha walked forward, trying to keep his head low. The constant noise, which accompanied him periodically, broke through a louder sound, as if thunderclaps were somewhere, as if something was invisibly hidden far away in this dust storm. Sasha stumbled, but eventually reached the dimly lit supermarket in the distance. He now knew where the bus stop was, which helped to calm his anxious soul. After passing the supermarket, Sasha realized where the bus parking lot was and started to walk there. As he got closer to the bus stop, he saw 3 taxi cabs with their taxi lights on. He approached the first cab and knocked on the window. To his surprise, the driver was asleep. Sasha knocked harder and pressed his face to the glass, trying to see inside. The driver sat motionless behind the wheel, and Sasha could barely make out his eyes. It was dark outside, and Sasha had trouble seeing if the driver's eyes were open or closed. He looked more closely at the driver and noticed a very unsettling detail. His mouth seemed to be hanging down, with a gaping blackness in its place. This gap seemed to grow, darken, and increase in size. Sasha was feeling a little frightened, but he could not look away. He was like a child watching these frightening changes. They did not even think about stopping. The giant black figure continued to move downward, almost reaching Sasha's stomach, and then the entire dark figure began to move towards him. At that moment, a loud horn sound came from behind. An imperceptibly close car approached, and Sasha flinched away from the window. In the dim darkness, he made out the faint green light of the taxi driver's indicator. Without thinking about it for a second, he quickly got into the car. "Hello," Sasha shouted, and he forcefully closed the passenger door. "Hush, hush," the driver said sarcastically, "where are we going, Commander?" Sasha apologized for the noise and said he was going to the village, home 2, of Dividing Street. He took out his phone and called his friend. "Welcome," said the driver, glancing at Sasha's phone. "It's useless," he added, looking at the screen. "Neither the internet nor the connection works." Sasha tried to continue, but the driver cut him off. "I recently received messages from my card at home," he said. "I thought maybe I had caught a signal or something, but I can't seem to get anywhere." The driver shook his head in disbelief. "It's so strange," he continued. "I've driven all over the city today, and I still can't get any connection. Maybe the storm is starting to subside." "Well, I guess you're right," Sasha replied. "Perhaps the weather is getting better." Despite the driver's interruption, Sasha continued to talk. "But I still don't understand why you didn't take me to the destination we agreed on," he said, trying to change the subject. The driver looked at him with a smile. "Don't worry about it," he said. "Just think of it as a surprise. Listen, my friend. I have some invaluable advice for you. You should go home. It's not a good idea to go anywhere during a storm. Today, I've met a lot of people and they told me all kinds of stories about the storm. For the last hour, I've felt on edge," the driver said, still looking ahead, and began searching for a pack of cigarettes near his seat. "How so?" Sasha asked, not sure what he meant. "Well, to be honest, this whole situation is a bit strange, isn't it? The storm, the emergency state, the lack of internet and communication, even the walkie-talkie that doesn't work. Sometimes, sad songs start playing on my frequency. The TV is working, but they ask us not to leave our homes, and it seems more like a recorded message. In the evening, they said the storm had subsided, but for me, things were only getting worse. And the people I ran into today? Where have they been all this time in our city? Well, mystery people. I was taking my aunt to work this morning, and we drove past the church in the middle of town. My aunt sat in the back seat, not saying a word, but when we got closer to the church, she spit on the window and started saying such things. I don't even want to say them, even if I'm not religious. Then I drove the two types for lunch. They sat in silence the whole way, and at the end, when leaving, they said to me, everything will be the same today as yesterday, only in complete contrast. Don't worry, there were normal people. Those who said bluntly that I should leave the city immediately from this storm. Only 20 evacuation buses left today from the station alone. I'm just saying, you know, those who wanted to leave were the people, and those who didn't say anything about the storm just blindly followed their way of life as if they forgot themselves. Do you understand? The driver asks and casts a quick glance at Sasha. I understand, but have you noticed anything strange today? Sasha asked carefully. Friend, is that not enough for you? The driver asks, laughing. I mean, it was quite strange. There was something that made it scary. It seemed to me today that. Sasha did not have time to finish his thought, as the car stopped and the driver interrupted him. We've arrived. Sasha quickly paid for the ride and got out of the car. The driver threw something behind him, but due to the loud noise of the storm, Sasha didn't understand what it was. He quickly dodged under the house and started walking around it, heading towards Tolia's door. Unlike Sasha's sleepy area, filled with new, bright buildings, the part of town where Talik lived was an old center, with ancient and dark four-floor buildings everywhere. After finding the right door, Sasha entered and began climbing the stairs to Talik's apartment. When he reached it, he felt another rush of anxiety and began to forcefully ring the doorbell. Inside, the amplified chirping of birds erupted, like the sound of a bird's alarm. Finally, Talik answered the door. Hello, Phew, he said, it's good you came. I had no idea what to do. Talik shook Sasha's hand and welcomed him inside. Hello, Sasha said, and, entering the apartment, began to remove his shoes. Of course, today it's some kind of very creepy, and then there's this, he said, and began to walk towards the hallway. So what happened? I had already imagined something, Sasha asked. Following Talik into the hallway, Sasha looked around the apartment. It was very poorly furnished. The room they were in had a simple layout. There was a small nightstand next to a sofa that was pushed up against the corner of the room. To the right, there was an open door leading to another room. An old, fat TV sat on a dusty, worn-out DVD player, and dirty carpet covered the floor. Another carpet with a different pattern covered the wall. A single dim light bulb hung from the ceiling without a cover. There were two tall windows and a door leading outside, but there were no curtains and the glass reflected the silhouettes of two people in the center of the hallway. After the incident, Talik had to live very frugally, saving money wherever possible, and giving money every month to those expensive cars that he had been lucky enough to hit. Sasha understood why Talik rented such cheap accommodations. She understood and tried to avoid discussing this topic further. Help me remove the door from its hinges. I probably need to trim it from below. I can't do this alone, said Talik and stood behind the door. And that's why you called me? At night? Asked Sasha, dumbfounded. Listen, I have no other friend to call. You are my only one. This is very important. You need to remove it, squeeze it slightly from below, put it back and close this room. It's better to do this as soon as possible. Looking at the floor, he said. What's so special about this room? Asked Sasha, still not understanding anything. I don't know. I don't go there. It's too dark and it should be closed, replied Talik in a completely calm tone. What do you mean? Asked Sasha. Well, it's dark there, that's why I don't go in there, said Talik in an absolutely natural tone and pretended like he had just asked a very silly question. Is there no way to switch on the light? Asked Sasha, still not thinking clearly. It's still too dark, answered Talik. Is it dark with light? Sasha asked, almost jokingly. Is it also dark during the day? And it's also dark during the day. It's always dark here. Did I call you to play a trick? Talik said. It's so dark. Too dark. So, how did you get inside the cabin? Sasha asked a bit irritably. Did all this trouble you? Talik said, when I moved here, I had already had trouble with money. You know I have to pay for the accident. Sasha said, I'm sorry. Well, you've lived here all this time, right? Everything was fine before the dust storm. It was locked. And today, when I came back from my shift, the room was wide open and the door stuck like it was raining all month. I couldn't even move, Talik replied and, for clarity, leaned against one of the doorways. After listening to Sasha, San just frowned and shook his head. The phrase, it's too dark, seemed strange to him and, for some reason, began to annoy him. As if wanting to do something to prove to himself, San asked. Where is the light switch? San replied, San, it's okay, I'm telling you. It's too dark, you don't need to go in there. But San did not think to listen to San's words. He walked towards the threshold of the room and stepped into the rectangle of light on the floor. His shadow quickly covered the remaining light and the darkness around him after the bright hallway gave off a faint greenish glow. So, where is the light switch, San? San said, without turning around. San pointed to a corner on the left. There's a far corner, he said seriously. Seriously, San. Now is not the time. Don't. In his mind, Sasha imagined the room was slightly smaller than the hallway, as evidenced by the sound and the barely visible shapes of the cabinets. He started walking slowly, carefully stepping so as not to collide with the expected furniture ahead. After taking 2 small steps, he stiffened up. It felt to him as if he should have already hit something. It was supposed to be so, but that didn't happen. He took a step, then another, and then a third. Still, the switch, like the wall, did not seem to be in his path yet. It could just not be happening in this small room. The back of his head began to prickle unpleasantly with the approach of fear. It became even more frightening when he turned around. In this small space, darkness seemed to envelop the rectangle of light from the doorway, and it slowly narrowed. Sasha saw the light getting smaller. He was moving his legs hard, but the damn door from the room didn't even think about approaching. It only shrank in front of his eyes and already narrowed down to the size of a small window. Sasha's heart started to beat faster. He became afraid. Already being ready to run away, he suddenly realized he was standing at the threshold and was only looking into the darkness. And all this was just in his imagination. When he came to his senses, as if he'd met an animal, he started slowly backing away, leaving that dark room. Talik said, I told you not to. It's way too dark in there. That's enough. Let's go. I'll put on the kettle. We'll make some coffee and start taking down the door. And he went to the kitchen. Sasha stood in front of the door for a while longer, still unable to understand what had happened. He felt uncomfortable, but he didn't want to bring up the topic with Talik or discuss it. Sitting at the kitchen table, he stirred the coffee monotonously, watching the tiny funnel form in the center of his cup. Talik was talking in the background, but Sasha didn't listen to him. There was a thick darkness in front of his eyes, like she was someone else. She was like a presence, almost like someone else or something else. All this time, Talik kept talking about the lack of communication and the bad internet. He explained why it could be like that, and then he fell silent, but Sasha didn't even notice. He continued to stir the cold coffee monotonously. "Sasha!" Talik shouted from the room, his voice filled with anxiety. Instantly jumping up, Sasha ran into the hallway and froze, staring at Talik in the middle of the room. He seemed to have stepped on a mine and couldn't move. This scene made Sasha feel uneasy. "Tolian? What's wrong?" Sasha asked in a cautious voice. Don't you feel anything?" Talik asked, and began to look at Sasha with horror in his eyes. "No," Sasha said uncertainly, drawing out the word. Talik pointed at the middle of the hallway with his eyes and said, "Come here." Sasha took 2 steps forward and stood next to Talik. Even without sensing anything, his fear burned and boiled inside him. Looking at Talik, Sasha began to understand what he was saying. "I don't know what's happening, but I'm really scared right now. I can't even move." "It happened in this room," Talik said, pointing at the space in front of them. This horror was conveyed to Sasha, who was standing next to Talik. His hands involuntarily shook from fright. Cold tremors shot through his stomach in waves. The back of his neck prickled with an unpleasant, cold itch. He felt as if even his own body were standing up. Something radiating horror filled the room. Sasha thought frantically about what was happening and shifted his gaze to the back of the room behind Talik. There was a blackness in the doorway, a room where it seemed too dark to enter. This darkness seemed to look at Sasha, as if it were something tangible. It was not simply the absence of light but the presence of something else. It seemed you could touch the darkness, take it and drown in it. With this specter present, the darkness in the room became thicker and more tangible. The light bulb above the ceiling shined dimmer and dimmer, sending a feeling of horror through Sasha's muscles, making his jaw involuntarily tighten. That he looked at the reflections in the windows, then he saw it. "I saw a hunched, twisted, and unnatural figure emerge from the room behind Talik. It was like a puppet made from prosthetics, moving slowly and absurdly, and with rudeness, it was approaching. With huge dark holes for eyes and a gigantic black mouth that literally sucked the already dim light out of the hallway, it was terrifying. Tearing his gaze from the window reflections, Sasha looked behind Talik and saw no one there. In horror, he then looked back at the window reflections again, looked there, and almost fell over in unbearable horror. The creepy, awkward figure that had just left Talik's room was already standing behind him, spreading out its long bony arms with sagging, white sleeves. Talik noticed Sasha's terror and turned his attention to the windows. It took him less time to understand what was happening than it did for Sasha. That he grabbed Sasha's hand and they both left the hall. "Hurry up. We have to go," he said and ran towards the front door. Talik was afraid to move, but Sasha did not even think to protest. Feeling the approaching chill from the other world on his back, he involuntarily looked around and saw the lights in the hallway dim. Just looking made his body feel like it was covered in ice, and there was still no one there. Not a single person visible in the reflections. Breathing heavily with fear, they fled out the door and Talik began rummaging through his pockets for keys to stop whatever was happening. Before he could fully shut the front door, something inside the apartment pulled it open and shut it again. Then several clicks of the lock could be heard inside. Talik and Sasha stared at each other in terror. They were afraid to take even a breath. Trembling, Talik glanced at the bright point in the peephole and started listening. There was nothing but silence inside the apartment, eerily hostile, and then something happened that left Talik's legs weak. The light in the hole dimmed for a few moments, as if someone were looking at them through there. Torn by a sense of horror, Sasha pulled the exhausted Talik along by the arm. They raced through one floor, then another, a third, and another after another. Their descent went on for 5 minutes, but the stairs never ended, just another identical flight after another. "What should we do, Tolian?" Sasha asked frantically. "What to do?" Keys, my house keys are at the hut. Talik said desperately. What keys? Sasha shouted, his emotions unrestrained. Talik started shining his phone on the numbers on the doorways. 44, 45, 46, it's crazy. I only have 12 apartments in this entrance, he said, not thinking. After going down another flight of stairs, he started flashing the numbers on the doors with his phone again. 47, 48, 49. He whispered. It seems the numbers are getting bigger, but they should be getting smaller, Sasha whispered too. Does that mean you need to climb up? Talik spoke with fear in his voice. I won't be able to pass your door again, Sasha started to say. We have no choice, we have to go, Talik said and started to climb the stairs. Sasha followed him. They walked for a relatively short amount of time, driven by fear. Talik continuously whispered the apartment numbers out loud, and when the number reached 12, his voice faltered. Well, the next floor belongs to me, apartment 9, he said, somewhat hesitantly. Let's quickly go through the floor and then we'll be done, right? Sasha suggested. What if it hears us? That's not an option. You have to walk really quietly, without making any noise, Talik said, and started to get up. Sasha followed him. When they reached the landing of Talik's floor, they leaned against the railing as if there were a cliff in front of their feet and began slowly passing the doors. The 7th, 8th, and 9th apartments. Sasha and Talik watched intently at the small light, the only source of light in the darkness around them. Talik remembered the horror of the light going dark in the peephole for a few seconds, and Sasha was still trembling. They had just reached the steps leading to the next floor and the light went dark again for a second. Someone looked into the peephole, and then something happened that caused Sasha and Talik to start running up the stairs, clutching each other. The sound of the door opening from Talik's apartment was heard, and they were already at the cherished exit at the front of the building and sprinted out, crashing into a wall of a dust storm. Sasha ran in one direction and Talik in another. They tried to call out to each other, but the loud noise of the wind drowned out their cries. Talik was heading towards his car and Sasha, as far away as possible from the entrance, did not immediately realize how Talik had disappeared from sight. When fear stopped chasing after him, he lost his bearings and no longer understood where he was. Around him were some tall bushes and unreachable flower beds, as if he'd entered the grounds of a school or kindergarten. A dust storm hit his face and he held out his hand, noticing that the way the dust fell looked more like rain. It was falling at an angle, getting stronger and scratching his face. Bowing his head, Sasha slowly walked, frantically thinking about what to do and where to find Talik. His thoughts went around in a circle and kept returning to the eerie sound of the door opening. There was a flash of light in his eyes as the darkness enveloped him. It was a terrifying moment, but Sasha decided that he would follow the same path and keep walking until he reached a landmark. With these thoughts, he began to walk forward and saw the lights of a car approaching from far away. The car drove slowly towards him, getting stuck in some small holes on the road. Suddenly, two headlights appeared in the distance, and Sasha felt a rush of relief. It was Talik. He had found him somehow, even though he had looked everywhere for him. Quickly, Sasha flew up to the car and opened the passenger door on the front side. Inside, he saw a stranger, sitting in the seat, looking straight ahead and not noticing him at all. Get in the back, Talik shouted from the driver's side, leaning slightly. Sasha didn't argue. He opened the door and quickly climbed into the car. He slammed the door shut and exhaled deeply. The car began to move and started driving slowly. Sonia, he said, taking another breath and extending his hand towards the stranger. The man sitting next to him did not respond in any way to Sasha. Sasha sat there for a while with his hand extended towards the stranger, then he lowered it and, speaking to Talik with annoyance, said, "Is he deaf, or what?" Talik replied casually, "Something like that." After the incident, Sasha didn't even think about getting into conflict. Instead, He replayed all the events that had happened in a few hours in his head over and over again. Especially what had happened in Tolik's apartment. Those thoughts sent prickly, cold goosebumps running down his spine. He tried to distract himself by thinking, but then he abruptly realized he didn't understand where they were going. "Where are we going, anyway?" Sasha asked. "There," Tolik responded emotionlessly. "Which way is there?" Sasha asked a little angrily. There was silence in response. "Where is there?" Sasha shouted, no longer trying to hide his irritation. "Well, there," Tolik said again, in that stingy, almost mocking voice. "Okay, fuck you," Sasha thought to himself and began to look out the window. The dust storm seemed to be moving its own dark ocean. It seemed as if their car were plowing through expanses of blackness, so that everything appeared to freeze. It was as if the car were standing still, while only the surroundings seemed to move. These thoughts left Sasha feeling rather uneasy. He began to lean closer to the window, trying to convince himself that the asphalt beneath the tires was moving and that the car was actually driving. But it wasn't. It was extremely quiet in the vehicle. Tolik, who sat in front, gripped the steering wheel tightly and stared straight ahead. He did not move it, did not change gears, nor could he hear his feet depressing the gas and the clutch. The car simply stood there, while everything else seemed to be in motion. As Sasha's uneasiness grew, he felt the phone in his pocket vibrate. Taking it out carefully, he saw messages on Telegram from Tolik. "Where are you?" "I'm at the entrance." "I'll be in the car at the entrance." "Go back to my house." "I'll be far away." "Sonia, where are you?" "Come back." He said, "It's too dark in there," a deep, guttural voice said from the front. Nothing was moving outside. Not even the dust storm. There was only darkness. Sasha kept looking at the messages on his phone. He couldn't see the darkness around the car. He couldn't tell how those sitting in front of him had dark eyes, or how their mouths were slowly expanding and turning black. They were expanding, their lower jaws hanging down to their very abdomen. They were turning into huge abyss, where there was nothing but darkness. He couldn't see them begin to turn slowly towards him. The third story, passport photos. You probably don't remember those strange rooms where you were taken for 3x4 passport photos. Maybe, if you're under 30, you never had time to notice them. I would never have thought that the most frightening story I'd ever heard would have anything to do with that particular place. 2 weeks ago, we usually went to the sauna. There were usually about 5 of us there, all from school. We talked about boring topics, just to get drunk and go home earlier. The level of friendship was about the same as always. So it wasn't unusual to invite someone new, someone we didn't know, to our company. During the gathering, we shared typical, once upon a time, stories. As the evening drew to an end, someone naturally fell asleep. Others managed to leave. And that very group of persistent fighters, who had drunk too much and reached a very unusual, sober drunk plateau, began to talk about various interesting topics. Once every 5 years, one of these topics concerns the otherworldly. So, in the presence of 2 of my friends and a friend of mine, at 3 in the morning, our conversation turned to these terrible topics. Diamond, a friend from my school, told me that he had seen a silhouette in his rearview mirror while driving cars from Lithuania. Another friend, Colleen, told a story about a needle in the door and a trip to a witch. I did not have anything to add to the conversation, but the story of Sani, a guest in our group, suddenly surfaced from the depths of my memory. We studied together at a technical school and, for the past few years, have seen each other almost daily since our workplaces are close by. He sells electronics and I sell household products. On Fridays, we drink beer and then go to a steam bath. That I remembered his story. He was a photographer in our technology department. His entire family has been involved in photography, filmmaking, and photography since the time of perestroika, the period of reforms in the Soviet Union. Not to say that he was the life of the party, but in the technology store, we exchanged game discs, and that was what we talked about. He told me this particular story while we were in the smoking area, in his final year as a technologist, after a seasonal part-time position. He worked in his office, in a dusty room next to the passport office. It was a small corridor with benches similar to those in an assembly hall. It was easy to get lost in there. At the end of the hallway, the Jakoska cash register was located next to a small store office, near which his workplace was. Express photo. The usual 3x4 photos, some of which could be picked up the next day for 5 hryvnias, and for 15 hryvnias express, which Sonia quickly edited in Photoshop and handed out after half an hour. He worked there 5 days per week, from 9 to 6, and mostly took passport photos. Of course, there were all sorts of interesting things for our relatively small town, like mug prints and t-shirt prints, but it was the passport photos that caused my friend to quit. It was the year 2008, and perhaps it was more modern in some ways, but specifically at their photo salon, there was a tripod in the middle of the room with a heavy Canon camera attached, from which a long cable went straight to a computer. In front of the camera there was a small chair, behind which was a white backdrop. When you arrive, you hang your clothes on a hanger, look in the mirror and preen up. Then, Sonia begins to instruct the person in front of the camera on how to pose and where to turn their head. Although the camera is quite impressive by 2008 standards, all the shortcomings of the technology from that time are still evident. Perhaps due to Sledge's lack of experience at the time, or perhaps due to limited technology, there is a slight shake of the head, and that is it, the picture is blurred. Even when he took several dozen at once, sometimes they were messed up. Sometimes, I had to capture a frame within minutes. Then, Sonia noticed something that terrified him. A woman in her late 40s or early 50s came to Sonia. She was an ordinary-looking woman, with no striking features or unusual details in her appearance. As always, she said, "Here's 15 hryvnias, can I have my photo taken?" Sonia replied, "Of course, here you are, hang your clothes up here, sit down in front of the mirror." The woman sat on a stool and Sonia told her to raise her chin and then showed her how to get up and stand behind the camera. Sonia tried to point the camera but it would not focus at all, and he kept asking, "How much longer will this take?" over and over, turning his head and coughing loudly in the background. Sonia eventually realized that he must have been in a hurry and the camera finally focused. When Sonia looked at the screen, he froze with fear. On the screen, the woman's face was distorted, with her upper lip raised slightly. She was trying to suppress a grin, but her face was trembling and her body was convulsing periodically, which she was struggling to suppress. Sana felt very uncomfortable. All he could do was watch her, staring at the small screen on the camera. His camera had a standard lens, which he called a peephole, and a small screen that displayed the image in more detail. Normally, Sonia avoided touching the camera, but even to take a photo, he used a special cord with a button. Once again, I tried to avoid touching the perfectly positioned camera, but then I reached for it to hide behind it from the wheezing person sitting in front of me, who was looking straight through the lens into my eyes. I quickly took a few dozen pictures, then jumped up in fear and asked to return in half an hour, but I could not find a spot for myself with my overwhelming fear. I started looking at the photos on the computer, but there was still the same woman with that grin. Her eyes were dark and shiny, the jaw is stretched forward, and the nose is wrinkled in a contemptuous expression. But all of the expressions and grimaces seemed barely noticeable. It was as if the woman managed to restrain herself from doing something more, and Sonia only saw tiny glimpses of something even worse. Sonia selected 4 of the less unsettling photos and printed them. Despite this, each of them still carried a hint of emotion that made them uncomfortable to look at. After half an hour to a day, no one had shown up for them. Of course, Sonia was scared and even asked his parents to be excused from work, but he felt pressured by family morals and did not want to miss a day's work. He assured himself that the woman was simply crazy and would recover in a few weeks. Then, a similar situation occurred. Now, it was the grandfather who the camera was having trouble focusing on, and as he stood in front of it, his face started to twist. At first, it was a grimace, with pursed lips, and Sonia watched in horror as he realized that what he was seeing was comparable to the woman's grimace. The grandfather's eyes kept bulging more and more, but he didn't say anything, nor did he make any special noises. He just struggled to suppress something within himself. Again, like the first time, Sonia was terrified, and he didn't try to get a good shot or catch the moment, just frantically pressing the button on the cord as if it was a trigger. Just like the first time, nobody came for the photos. They were on little green Kodak file folders on his desk, one on top of another. Being in the same room as them made Sonia feel uncomfortable. He kept moving them to the cupboard next to the entrance. At the psychological level, I tried to keep them as far from myself as possible. There was something about them that was alien to me. Although the horns and fangs from those in the photos were missing, it didn't make it any easier for Sonia. Ordinary people came to Sonia for photos for a whole month. Then, one day, a woman came and sat down with her little girl. The girl kept fidgeting and her mother would constantly shush her. She also kept straightening her pigtails as she sat. Sonia was waiting for the perfect moment, and then he noticed something strange. He raised his head and looked at the mother's face. She was standing to the side, her eyes fixed on the camera lens, and her face had a twisted expression. Her arms were twisted behind her back and her legs were apart in an awkward squat. The child's head was turned to one side, as if she was listening to something, and the distorted face of the person was looking towards the camera, even though they were not in the picture, standing to the right of their daughter. When Sonia looked at the child's face, he almost pressed the shutter release button on the camera wire. Her mouth was wide open and her head was tilted back, as if she were sitting in a dentist's chair. Strained eyes rolled up as he told me, at the time, that during that period, he had shat himself. Not literally. It seemed like a classic everyday exaggeration to me, but after what he told me in our gatherings at the bathhouse and after what happened that night, I doubt his words less and less. That episode with the girl and her mom finally finished him off. He quit, or rather, quit his job. It was our final course in tech, and then he told me a part of the story I outlined above. But there was another part, the next one. After we went to different cities to study, after he failed to get back on track in adulthood and had to go back to his dad's business. 3 years later, in the same photo studio with the name Express Photo, I must admit, I believe in a lot of things. Devils, ghosts, evil eyes, love spells, spade ladies and horoscopes, to name a few. Therefore, I don't need to be convinced of what happened or didn't happen, Sonia said and took a long drink of beer. Just accept that what I'm saying is true, and that will be enough, he continued. It would be easier if it was all fiction. If you like, I can show you some photos at the end, but for now, let's go back to the story. He started to tell it. When Sonia returned to his former job, the old clients didn't take long to show up. He was still watching them through the small camera screen, as subtle, creepy expressions flitted across their faces. They puffed up their cheeks, smiled, strained their jawlines, and bulged their eyes. They never displayed aggression towards Sana, they did not rush towards him. They simply behaved in a very frightening manner. The scary thing was that these strange behaviors could not be attributed to a specific age group or social class. Young girls and older adults alike exhibited these unusual traits. Within each age group, there was someone who sometimes clearly and sometimes less obviously displayed a terrible trait. From a spasm on their face to a snarl and an extended jawline, from a cheekbone slipping to a twisted lip or a rolled eye, all these behaviors sometimes were obvious, more often fleeting, but always followed a pattern. The more time they spent in front of the lens, the more likely they were to twist their expressions. A few seconds before the lens did not reveal anything, but when they looked directly at the camera for about a minute, strange things started to happen. It was like they were starting to realize themselves, not as people, but as what was inside of them. Something was awakening, and it seemed to recall itself. I do not know how it worked, but it was as if they saw themselves on camera. Some people liked it, and they took their time posing, although it was a rather creepy sight. Others, on the other hand, began to become satanic. They twisted and broke, and everything was accompanied by terrible, guttural noises. But the outcome was the same: something alien became aware of itself. Sonia realized too late what could be hidden behind all this. For some reason, he watched more calmly every time. He wished to see what would happen if he held the camera for more than a minute. His first experiment turned out to be successful, though it is hard to say whether this word can really be applied to something like this. The woman's skin turned white, so Sana thought she might faint. His lips curled back, making his face look rather cadaverous. Sonia took a photo of the scene. As always, nobody came to take photos later. For the second time, he decided to do this to a fat man. He held the camera in front of the man for about 2 minutes, during which time the man's face became a moronic expression, with his eyes wide open and eyebrows furrowed. His head dropped down, his cheeks frozen in an uncertain smile. Then he began to laugh and choke. He fell on the floor, struggling and fitting. His huge body with arms folded over his chest was jumping on the ground like a giant fish. Sonia called for an ambulance and stood over the man, afraid to touch him. The man was looking directly at Sonia with the same expression, pointing a small, plump finger at him. As if to say, "It's you, you. Lifeless and powerless." This could be a symptom of a mold on the wall, or a clump of dirt from a downpour. This incident should have dissuaded Sonia from doing something like this again. The arrival of the ambulance and the finger pointing at him may have caused him to lose touch with reality. I have no other explanation for this. However, he continued his experiments. He held them in front of the lens for longer and longer each time, and they sat there, with their faces contorted, until he eventually took a picture. During these experiments, he reached 5 minutes, but then something happened that scared him, against the backdrop of all the bad things that had happened to him before. In the printed photos, there was a gap in those who had spent more than 5 minutes in front of the camera. There were 4 empty squares. Sonia expressed his thoughts about this in his mind. Do you know what the most terrible thing is for a demon? Its name. This is a cliché that sometimes, when you see a similar scene in a movie, you involuntarily start to smile. "Tell me your name," Sonia shouted a little louder. And another thing I realized is that for a demon or some other kind of evil, there's nothing scarier than the fact that they are being photographed. These glitches or bugs are probably the only things that give them away. You probably saw how all sorts of people, just pointing a camera at them, instantly shout, "Do not turn it off. Put the camera away." Despite the fact that a phenomenon like shooting a person on video is very new in the context of human history. We simply wouldn't have had time to develop a specific aversion to filming, bringing it to the level of conditioned reflexes. Which means that there's something more here, and maybe some of you have noticed that some people react to the camera quite normally, while others immediately start to twist their faces into a bad smile. No, certainly not in the cases that I have seen, but still. That is why I began to feel like I was seeing something supernatural. Or the other way around, the demons were seeing themselves. You know, like when you put 2 mirrors facing each other, they start to flicker and go into a state of stupor. This explains everything. However, those empty photos, I couldn't explain how, unfortunately. Everything's clear. Diamond, who was almost asleep, woke up. From his sudden exclamation, Kalian, who had already been openly snoring on the sofa, raised his head. "You took pictures of them, but all you've got left are just blank photos. Well done." Diamond shouted with satisfaction, lighting a cigarette. "Not really," said Sonia, and moved on to the last part of his story. After the people disappeared from the last photos, he had a strange feeling that there was something important on their faces, in those twisted faces, that he was missing. He also had a collection of photographs that were less than 5 minutes old, in which the subjects he held in front of the camera were. Every day, he looked at them for a long time, looking at their faces over and over again. He was trying to find something that would help him understand the reason for those faces. The thing that scared him was that there was no clear pattern. All the faces were as horrible as they were unique and scary. As he scrolled through hundreds of faces over and over, he began to notice that his tongue would turn strangely in his mouth, followed by his nose wrinkling. As a joke, he sometimes turned the mouse wheel using a hooked finger to mimic what he saw on one of the photographs. Every other time, he caught himself thinking that if he looked at a person's face for a little bit longer than a minute, his face would end up looking just like the person in the photo he was staring at. The more he stared at these photos, the more his face started to look like them. He would sit in front of the mirror and make faces for hours until something similar to the person in the picture showed on his face. Weeks went by like that until he finally realized that he actually liked it. There wasn't a day that went by when he didn't see his face in the mirror with some creepy expression. In telling this story, Sonia didn't make any lyrical references to the fact that he might have gone crazy at that point. He said it all in all seriousness, without making any jokes in between or trying to make light of it. The more details he went into, the more uncomfortable everyone became. Even Diamond, who occasionally makes drunken jokes in the middle of a story, started to listen more carefully. For months, Sonia spent hours in front of the mirror, repeating the faces he saw, before he started taking photos of himself on his own camera. He used the same setup with a wire and a button, and sat in front of it for 5 or 10 minutes every day. As he talked about taking the photos, white foam started rolling around his lips, and Diamond kept looking at me from time to time. The night was already turning the wrong way by 4 o'clock, and I was eager to go home and see my wife. The conversation gradually turned to Sonia's photos, which Diamond kept pressing him to show. He kept asking about those creepy photos of scary demons, and trying to make Sonia's story sound like a joke. Diamond tried to get me involved in the conversation too, by waking Colleen up. But instead of ending with, "I don't have any pictures, but that's what happened," Sonia stood and reached for his jeans, saying that there was no point in continuing the conversation. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a small, glossy square. He handed it to Diamond, who was standing there in surprise. From a distance, I could see that there were 4 identical squares in front of him. "So it's you," said Diamond, looking at Sonia in surprise and then taking a closer look at the photos in his hand. "Wait. But how? But it's you." For some reason, Diamond looked at Sonia and then the photos again. "And how are you?" he asked, his jaw protruding forward. "I don't understand," he said, taking a closer look at the photo in his hand. Diamond seemed to be trying to repeat himself, as if he couldn't quite understand what he was seeing in the photograph. Still holding the photo, he jumped up and looked in the mirror. After looking at the photo and his reflection, he started making creepy faces. He stretched his jaw and strained his cheekbones. For some reason, I didn't want to watch him do it and started to dress hurriedly. Hundreds of faces with grimaces, creepy expressions and mugshots popped up in my head. They flew before my eyes like an obsession. And only when Colleen, who didn't understand anything, woke up sleepy and still drunk, did I realize that these weren't flying faces. It wasn't an obsession, it was Diamond's cry, which had entered my mind in a strange way. Diamond was screaming, clutching his head and howling. His eyes were full of pain and screamed, "Help!" Instead of his face there was a long snout and a natural mouth. His jaw was so far forward that his skull had acquired equine features. It was just jammed and he couldn't open his mouth to say anything. He just mumbled strange words as tears streamed down his cheeks. A sleepy bath attendant heard the screams and, when she saw Diamond's face, crossed herself and stood still. It was not surprising that an ambulance was called a few minutes earlier by a drunk Colleen. I do not know what miracle led him to understand what was happening. It was also not surprising that Diamond didn't remember what happened. I would also like to say that it is not surprising that Sonia is missing, and 2 drunk bodies, one of whom had his jaw broken again and is now eating through a straw with his mouth sewn shut, do not recall that he was with us at all. However, what is really unusual is that, next to me at the market where I work, instead of Sannon's electronics store, there was an empty stand with the faded sign, "Rent," that had already turned yellow. They talked about ghosts. Colleen spoke, Diamond muttered. A lot of people said they didn't tell anyone, but they all keep talking about ghosts, but somehow that doesn't bother me. But the real scary thing is the place where the photo salon used to be. It's right there, across the street from the passport office. The sign has completely faded away and can barely be seen. The stupid benches had been taken away a long time ago, and instead there are only 3 worn office chairs there. The hallway still smells of lost time. Instead of the cash registers, there is now draft beer, and the stationery has been replaced with a lingerie store. Only, Express Photo, is left in its place, an iron door. It has been closed for a long time, and only the shelf in front of it is still hanging in its original place. It is long faded, and those same 3x4 photo samples can barely be seen on a white background. Even with all these things, I recognized Sonia easily. Next to each photo, a long time ago, someone wrote something with a pen that was their own. It was like a name or nickname. Sonia. He was looking straight ahead with his nose slightly upturned, if I may say so. His jaw was slightly forward and his eyebrows were raised. There was something about that expression that I didn't understand.